While not all leaders had formal military training, the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York and the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis created dedicated cadres of professional officers whose understanding of military science had profound effect on the conduct of the American Civil War and whose lasting legacy helped forge the traditions of the modern U.S. officer corps of all service branches. The Union civilian military leaders. President Abraham Lincoln was Commander-in-Chief of the Union Armed Forces throughout the conflict. After his April 14, 1865 assassination, Vice President Andrew Johnson became the nation's chief executive. Lincoln's first Secretary of War was Simon Cameron. Edwin M. Stanton was confirmed to replace Cameron in January 1862. Thomas A. Scott was Assistant Secretary of War. Gideon Welles was Secretary of the Navy, aided by Assistant Secretary of the Navy Gustavus Fox. Regular Army officers. When the war began, the American Standing Army or Regular Army consisted of only 1080 commissioned officers and 15,000 enlisted men. Although 142 regular officers became Union generals during the war, most remained frozen in their regular units. That stated, most of the major Union wartime commanders had significant previous regular Army experience. Over the course of the war, the commanding general of the United States Army was, in order of service, Winfield Scott, George B. McClellan, Henry Halleck, and finally, Ulysses S. Grant, Robert Anderson, Don Carlos Buell, John Buford, Ambrose Burnside, Edward Canby, Philip Street, George Cook, Jacob Dawson Cox, Thomas Turpin Crittenden, Thomas Leonidas Crittenden, Samuel Curtis, Abner Doubleday, James A. Garfield, Quincy Adams Gilmore, Ulysses S. Grant, Henry Wager Halleck, Winfield Scott Hancock, Joseph Hooker, Andrew A. Humphreys, Henry Jackson Hunt, George B. McClellan, Irvin McDowell, James B. McPherson, Joseph K. Mansfield, George Meade, Montgomery C. Meigs, Edward Ord, John Pope, John F. Reynolds, William Rosecrans, John Schofield, Winfield Scott, Philip Sheridan, William T. Sherman, Andrew Jackson Smith, William Farrar Smith, George Stoneman, George Henry Thomas, Alfred Thomas Archimedes Torbett, John E. Wood. Militia and political leaders appointed to Union military leadership under the United States Constitution. Each state recruited, trained, equipped, and maintained local militia. Regimental officers were appointed and promoted by state governors. After states answered Lincoln's April 15, 1861, 90-day call for 75,000 volunteer soldiers, most Union states' regiments and batteries became known as volunteers, to distinguish between state and regular Army units. Union brigade-level officers could receive two different types of federal commissions: U.S. Army or U.S. volunteers. While most Civil War generals held volunteer or brevet rank, many generals held both types of commission. Regular rank was considered superior. Edward D. Baker, Nathaniel Prentice Banks, Francis Preston Blair, Jr., Benjamin Franklin Butler, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, John Adams Dix, John C. Fremont, John Alexander McClernand, Daniel Sickles, Native American and international officers in Union Army, reflecting the multinational makeup of the soldiers engaged. Some Union military leaders derived from nations other than the United States: Philippe Comte de Paris, Michael Corcoran, Vladimir Krizanovsky, Thomas Francis Maher, Ely Parker, Alborn F. Schupf, Karl Schaas, Franz Sigel, Acute Gis de Trebriand, Ivan Turchaninov. Union naval leaders. The rapid rise of the United States Navy during the Civil War contributed enormously to the North's ability to effectively blockade ports and Confederate shipping from quite early in the conflict. handicapped by an aging 90-ship fleet, and despite significant manpower losses to the Confederate Navy after secession. A massive ship construction campaign embracing technological innovations from civil engineer James Buchanan Eads and naval engineers like Benjamin F. Isherwood and John Erickson, along with 4 years' daily experience with modern naval conflict, put the U.S. Navy onto a path which has led to today's world naval dominance. John A. Dahlgren, Charles Henry Davis, Samuel Francis DuPont, David Farragut, Andrew Hull Foote, Samuel Phillips Lee, David Dixon Porter, John Ancrum Winslow, John Lorimer Walden. The Confederacy. Civilian military leaders. Jefferson Davis was named provisional president on February 9, 1861, and assumed similar commander-in-chief responsibilities as would Lincoln. On November 6, 1861, Davis was elected President of the Confederate States of America under the Confederate Constitution. Alexander H. Stephens was appointed as Vice President of the Confederate States of America on February 18, 1861, and later assumed identical vice presidential responsibilities as Hannibal Hamlin did. Several men served the Confederacy as Secretary of War, including Leroy Pope Walker, Judah P. Benjamin, George W. Randolph, James Seddon, and John C. Breckinridge. Stephen Mallory was Confederate Secretary of the Navy throughout the conflict. Former regular Army officers. In the wake of secession, many regular officers felt they could not betray loyalty to their home state. As a result, some 313 of those officers resigned their commission and in many cases took up arms for the Confederate Army. Himself a graduate of West Point and a former regular officer, Confederate President Jefferson Davis highly prized these valuable recruits to the cause and saw that former regular officers were given positions of authority and responsibility. Richard H. Anderson, Pierre Beauregard, Milledge Luke Bonham, Braxton Bragg, Simon Bolivar Buckner, Sr., George B. Crittenden, Samuel Cooper, Jubal Anderson Early, Richard S. Ewell, Franklin Gardner, Robert S. Garnett, Josiah Gorgaz, William Joseph Hardy, Ambrose Powell Hill, Daniel Harvey Hill, John Bell Hood, Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson, Albert Sidney Johnston, Joseph E. Johnston, Robert E. Lee, Mansfield Lovell, James Longstreet, Humphrey Marshall, Dabney Herndon Maury, John Hunt Morgan, John C. Pemberton, George Pickett, Edmund Kirby Smith, Gustavus Woodson Smith, J.E.B. Stuart, William B. Taliaferro, Earl Van Dorn, Joseph Wheeler. Militia and political leaders appointed to Confederate military leadership. The land of Davy Crockett and Andrew Jackson. The state military tradition was especially strong in southern states, some of which were until recently frontier areas. Several significant Confederate military leaders emerged from state unit commands. John C. Breckinridge, Benjamin F. Cheatham, Nathan Bedford Forrest, Wade Hampton, James L. Kemper, Ben McCulloch, Leonidas Polk, Sterling Price, Richard Taylor. Native American and international officers in Confederate Army. While no foreign power sent troops or commanders directly to assist the Confederate States, some leaders derived from countries other than the United States. Patrick Cleburne, Stand Watia, Camille Armand, Jules Marie, Prince de Polignac, Raleigh E. Colston, Collett Leventhorpe, George Street, Ledger Grenfell. Confederate naval leaders. The Confederate Navy possessed no extensive shipbuilding facilities. Instead, it relied on refitting captured ships or purchased warships from Great Britain. The South had abundant navigable inland waterways, but after the Union built a vast fleet of gunboats, they soon dominated the Mississippi, Tennessee, Cumberland, Red and other rivers, rendering those waterways almost useless to the Confederacy. Confederates did seize several Union Navy vessels in harbor after secession, and converted a few into ironclads, like the CSS Virginia. Blockade runners were built and operated by British naval interests, although by late in the war the CS Navy operated some. A few new vessels were built or purchased in Britain, notably the CSS Shenandoah and the CSS Alabama. These warships acted as raiders, wreaking havoc with commercial shipping. Aggrieved by these losses, in 1871 the U.S. government was awarded damages from Great Britain in the Alabama claims. John Mercer Brooke, Isaac Newton Brown, Franklin Buchanan, James Dunwoody Bullock, Catesby Ap Roger Jones, Matthew Fontaine Maury, Raphael Semmes, Josiah Tattnall, James Iredell Woodall,